You know, Alex, there's a specific kind of quiet that happens in a shop when someone realizes they've just disconnected a brake line and they don't have a drip pan nearby. It's the sound of a grown man holding his breath while a $5 a pint fluid tries to find its way into his favorite pair of boots.
Speaking from a place of very soggy, very corrosive experience there, Tiger, because I remember you mentioning those boots were retired last summer.
They didn't retire, they were medically discharged. Brake fluid is basically industrial strength paint stripper that decided to become a lubricant. It doesn't play nice, but that's the thing about brakes. Everyone treats them like this dark mechanical magic, but at its heart, it's just a game of high pressure liquid pushing on some metal crackers.
Metal crackers. Right. I'm sure the engineers at the factory love that technical term. But seriously, for most people, the braking system is a total black box until it starts making a sound like a silverware drawer falling down a flight of stairs.
And by then, you're not just doing maintenance, you're performing an autopsy. I had a guy bring in a truck once, beautiful old square body, and he told me it chirped a bit when he stopped. Alex, I pulled the wheel off, and the inner brake pad wasn't just gone. It had friction welded itself to the piston. The rotor looked like a vinyl record that had been played with a masonry nail.
Okay, so before we get to the masonry nail stage of neglect, let's actually break this down. If I'm looking at my wheel, what am I actually seeing? We talk about pads and rotors, but how does the squeeze actually happen?
Think of it like a C-clamp. Your caliper is that big, heavy iron jaw sitting over the edge of the disc, the rotor. When you hit the pedal, you're pushing fluid down a straw. That fluid pushes a piston inside the caliper, which squeezes two pads against the spinning rotor. It turns all that kinetic energy, the going fast part, into heat. A lot of heat.
Which is why people say their brakes fade if they're riding them down a mountain, right? The heat just has nowhere to go?
Exactly. You're essentially trying to turn a moving car into a giant space heater. If those pads get too hot, they stop biting. They just sort of glaze over. They get a surface like a polished marble floor. And suddenly your stopping distance feels like you're trying to park a boat on wet grass.
So, most of us wait for the squeak of shame before we check anything. But I was reading that guide from State Automotive, and they mentioned things like a spongy pedal or the car pulling to one side. If I feel the car diving toward the ditch every time I slow down, is that just a pad wearing out?
Usually, that's a sign that one side is working harder than the other. Imagine you're trying to stop a merry-go-round by grabbing it with one hand. It wants to pivot. If you got a seized caliper slide pin on the left side, the right side is doing all the heavy lifting. This little guy right here, the slide pin, is the unsung hero of the whole operation. It's what lets the caliper move back and forth so the pads wear evenly. If the rubber boot on this pin tears and lets a little salt or road grime in there, it'll lock up tighter than a rusty gate. I've seen pins so stuck, I had to use a MAP gas torch and enough swear words to peel wallpaper just to get them to budge.
Wait, so when people do a pad slap, just throwing new pads on and calling it a day, they're skipping the most important part?
A pad slap is like putting a silk tie on a pig that hasn't had a bath in 3 years. You might look better for a second, but the underlying situation is still a mess. If you don't clean those slides and put fresh silicone paste on them, those brand new pads are going to wear out in 6 months, and you'll be right back where you started, wondering why your gas mileage dropped because your brakes are essentially on all the time.
Okay, let's talk about the fluid. Eric the Car Guy and a few of these other pros emphasize the fluid, but I feel like most people go the entire life of a car without ever touching that reservoir unless the light comes on.
And that is a recipe for a very expensive Saturday. Brake fluid is hygroscopic. That's a fancy way of saying it's a sponge for water. It'll literally suck moisture out of the air through the microscopic pores in your rubber hoses.
Water in the lines? That sounds counterproductive for something that relies on being uncompressible.
Bingo. Water boils at 212 degrees. Brake fluid can handle 500 plus. If you've got water in your lines and you're braking hard, that water turns into steam. You can't compress a liquid, but you can sure compress steam. That's when you hit the pedal and it goes straight to the floorboard like you're stepping on a marshmallow. It's a terrifying feeling.
So, what's the interval? Is this a once a year thing or a when it looks like swamp water thing?
Most manufacturers say every 2 to 3 years. If it looks like dark maple syrup, you're already behind the curve. Fresh stuff should look like a pale white wine. I always tell people, if you're already in there changing the pads, take the extra 20 minutes to bleed the lines. It's the difference between a pedal that feels like a brick wall and one that feels like a wet sponge.
You mentioned bleeding the lines, which sounds like a medieval medical procedure. For someone doing this at home, what's the Tiger-approved way to not end up with air in the system? Because I've heard horror stories about people losing their brakes entirely because they let a bubble in.
Air is the enemy. It's the uninvited guest at the dinner party. The trick is simple. Never let the reservoir run dry. It's like keeping the punch bowl full. If you're pumping fluid out of the bottom at the wheel, you got to be pouring it in at the top. And for heaven's sake, if you're doing it with a partner, make sure you're on the same page. I once had a cousin helping me. I told him to hold the pedal down. He thought I said release, and he sucked a giant gulp of air back into the master cylinder.
Let me guess, that cousin isn't invited to the shop anymore?
Let's just say he's better at holding the flashlight than he is at operating the pedals.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the actual replacement. I see people using C-clamps to push the pistons back in. Is there a trick to that, or is it just brute force?
Brute force is a dangerous game with modern cars. If you've got a rear brake with an integrated parking brake, you can't just push that piston back. It's on a threaded screw. If you try to C-clamp that, you'll hear a pop that sounds exactly like several $100s leaving your bank account. You have to rotate those back in.
See, that's the kind of thing that isn't in the quick start guide. What about the rotors? Do you replace them every time? I've heard the resurfacing versus replacing debate go on forever.
Back in the day, rotors had enough meat on them to be turned on a lathe 3 or 4 times. These days, rotors are built as light as possible to save weight and fuel. They're practically disposable. By the time you pay a shop $30 to turn an old, rusty rotor, you could have just bought a new one for $40. Plus, a fresh rotor gives those new pads a perfectly flat surface to bed into.
Bedding in. Explain that. Is that like breaking in a new pair of shoes?
Exactly. You can't just slap new pads on and do a 0 to 60 drag race. You need to marry the two surfaces. I usually take the car to a quiet back road and do a series of medium-strength stops. You want to get some heat into them, so a tiny layer of pad material transfers over to the rotor. If you do it right, your brakes will be silent and smooth. If you skip it, you might end up with judder, that annoying vibration in the steering wheel that feels like the car is trying to shake its own teeth out.
Shaking its own teeth out. I'm going to remember that next time my steering wheel starts shimmying at a red light. I noticed in one of the Eric the Car Guy videos, he puts grease on the back of the pads. That feels wrong. Isn't grease the enemy of friction?
You're right to be skeptical. You never, ever get grease on the business end, the friction surface. But on the back, that's for noise. Brakes squeal because the pad is actually vibrating at a high frequency against the piston. A tiny, and I mean tiny, dab of high-temp grease or brake quiet compound acts like a dampener. It's like putting your hand on a ringing bell.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the people who say they don't need to do any of this because they drive gently? The State Automotive blog mentioned that aggressive driving wears brakes out faster, but can driving too gently actually be bad?
It's the old lady syndrome. If you never use your brakes firmly, the sliders never move their full range, and the rotors never get hot enough to burn off light surface rust. In the Rust Belt, where they salt the roads like they're seasoning a giant pretzel, those brakes will actually seize up from lack of use. You need to give them a good workout once in a while just to keep the parts moving. Use them or lose them.
So, if I'm a DIYer listening to this, and I'm thinking about tackling my first brake job this weekend, what's the one tool or the one gotcha that catches people off guard?
The gotcha is usually the rusted-on rotor. You take the caliper off, you take the bracket off, and that rotor is fused to the wheel hub like it was birthed there. People start beating on it with a hammer, which is fine, but they hit the lugs and ruin the threads.
I can see you doing that. Don't tell me.
Oh, I've been the guy at the parts store at 8 p.m. on a Sunday buying a new wheel stud because I got a little too Thor-like with a 5-pound sledge. The pro tip, use a bolt and a nut through the caliper bracket hole to push the rotor off from the back. It's quiet, it's elegant, and it doesn't involve me sweating through my shirt while screaming at a piece of cast iron.
Elegant. I like that. It's better than percussive maintenance.
And the one tool? A real torque wrench. Please, for the love of all that is holy, don't just guess on your lug nuts or your caliper bolts. If a caliper bolt backs out while you're driving, that caliper will swing up and lock the wheel instantly. That's not a shop disaster story. That's a call the insurance company story.
That's a sobering thought. I think we sometimes forget that beneath all the fun shop talk, these 4 pieces of friction material are the only thing keeping us from becoming part of the scenery.
That's the truth. You can have 1,000 horsepower under the hood, but if you can't turn it back into heat and stop, you're just a passenger in a very fast metal box.
So, the takeaway for today? Don't just pad slap, check your sliders, don't be afraid of fresh fluid, and for heaven's sake, keep the sledgehammer away from the wheel lugs.
You nailed it. And maybe, just maybe, keep a drip pan under those brake lines. Your boots will thank you.
Thanks for the schooling, Tiger. I'm going home to check my fluid. And if it looks like maple syrup, I'm calling you.
Bring the pancakes, Alex. We'll make a day of it.